people here are joining us on Facebook and not on Zoom. I know Francine joins us a lot on Facebook, and there's a lot of people that when they're traveling or they don't want to or they can't connect to Zoom, they're with us on Facebook. So that's kind of cool. We even have some people watching us out of the country. There's people in Canada that are watching us right now. That's scary. Canadians, what?
I didn't used to think Canadians were scary.
I know. There you go. So we have, so we got people around somebody's watching us from Palm Springs. Anyways, we have, we're on page, Marcia wants to know what page in the Tanakh we're on. We're in Book of Samuel, 1 Samuel chapter 15, which I don't know. Did you get it? Good job. I'm not sure what page it is on your various Bibles, but we put it up here for you to see. And what we read last week and what we had to look at was the story of King Saul. And now we're actually jumping almost immediately after really only reading a couple weeks. You could say we got introduced to King Saul 3 weeks ago. And now we're already jumping into King David. Today we're going to be introduced to King David. And it means that there's not a lot of the Bible that deals just with King Saul. And we've talked about that before. In the Bible, there's people that we just really don't know that much about. Isaac is one of the other ones we talk about, because Isaac really only has about 2 or 3 chapters in the Tanakh.
No one's wearing masks.
Okay. Two or three chapters on 2 or 3 chapters on Isaac and 2 or 3 chapters on King Saul, and that's it on these guys. And so it's kind of interesting that we have not a lot of information about these guys, but it is sometimes, I think, more telling the fact that what we don't have kind of in some cases will kind of give us an idea of what the agenda is. And the agenda here is definitely not to make King Saul look like a good guy. And King Saul, what we read about here is that the very end of the last chapter, what we just read at the end of chapter 14, which, as you can see, is a super long chapter. It goes to verse 52. We read a little bit about Saul's family. We're introduced to the fact that he has 3 sons and 2 daughters, Merav and Michal. Michal will become pretty critical later on in the story. And we know his wife's name, Ahinoam. And we also know about his cousin. Now, he's called Abiner or Avner, usually known as Avner. He's the son of Saul's uncle. That is it's a very long way of saying cousin. That's because there is no word in Hebrew for cousin. A cousin is that your ben dod is your uncle's son. So it's interesting that there really wasn't a word for cousin in Hebrew. And still even in modern Hebrew, we call somebody a ben dod. We say they're our father's, they're our uncle's son, whatever. So it's weird, you know? And so we know a little bit about his family. And the last words that we read were that there was fighting between the Philistines all the days of Saul. And that really doesn't tell us a lot about Saul's time as king, other than he's fighting Philistines. That's kind of wild that we don't know much about what he did, what kind of authority he had, how he divided authority. But we also read that Saul, whenever he saw any stalwart man or warrior, he would take him into his service, which means that Saul's idea of creating an army was to pretty much, well, he didn't say he shanghaied him. It says when he saw some guy that was tough, he brought him into the army. That's not exactly the way you're supposed to draft an army, but it is an interesting way. It basically means that rather than have it like a universal conscription, when you see a guy who is tough, you bring him in. The translation of stalwart man or warrior is an ish gibor, which means, we usually mean that to be a hero. The gibor is a hero, but it also means a strong guy. It doesn't mean a hero necessarily. It could be, doesn't mean not a hero, but the word gibor, which we usually use for a hero, can also just be someone who's strong. Vura means strength. So we would have called them in the old days, back in Brooklyn or Lower East Side even, we'd call them a starker. That's a person who is a big guy. And, you know, I guess if you're a big guy in the Jewish community, it makes a big physical guy, it makes you a little stand out maybe sometimes. I don't know if it did that during Saul's time, but it says that he would see these big guys and he would pick them. And then a Ben Chayil means literally a man, a son of valor, which is why they call it kind of a warrior. But it really means somebody who's courageous, you know, like an Esha Chayil is a woman of valor. It's a courageous, or in this case, a man of valor. And it basically says he brought these guys into his entourage. So that's the way he decided who would be part of his inner circle, strong guys. Does not say he took in smart guys. Does not say he took in ethical guys. It does not say he took in people who were sophisticated in the ways of administration, governing, but he took in big guys, which gives us a little idea that Saul maybe favors strength and courageousness, which is not bad, but it isn't necessarily bringing in people who are smart or ethical or administratively capable. And that's what he did. And so that's all we really have about Saul. We're going to now read about some more of his battles and basically some more of the things that make him unfit to be king. Because that's pretty much all we get from Saul. Last week we read that he makes a sacrifice too early. He rushes a sacrifice, that he curses his son when his son rushes into battle, and rather than, again, kind of create a situation so that, you know, it works out well, he ends up cursing him, and they have like literally a chance for Saul to even kill Jonathan. Things are not going well. Like nothing, even when something good happens, somehow it turns out bad. You can't catch a break. That's what's going to happen today as we read about his not catching a break, but finally getting broken. So this is chapter 15. This is kind of where it all goes down. This is some interesting stuff. We've already said it's very likely that this really happened, or some version of it. And so we're left with a pretty tough story about King Saul. All right, so here's what happens. Rosemary, if you'd like to take it away for us.
Samuel said to Saul, I am the one the Lord sent to anoint you king over his people Israel. Therefore, listen to the Lord's command. Thus says the Lord of hosts, I am exacting the penalty for what Amalek did to Israel, for the assault he made upon them on the road on their way up from Egypt.
Yeah, and again, to remind everybody, the Amalekites, way back in Exodus, attacked us when we came out of Egypt. Right after we crossed the Sea of Reeds, they attacked us. The Amalekites attacked us, and they attacked the women and children. They attacked the back of the entourage. That was a whole mass of people coming out of Egypt. But they attacked us immediately after we crossed the Red Sea. And they attacked the weakest. They attacked us when we should have been celebrating, when we should have been enjoying this great miracle of crossing the Sea of Reeds. They attacked us. And the rabbis point out that what the Amalekites did by attacking us was horrible for a lot of reasons. Not only that they attacked the women and children, but that by attacking us, they actually took the Jewish people who had just been redeemed by God and made everyone in the world now think, you can attack the Jews. If you can attack the Jews right after they cross the Sea of Reeds, then you can attack them anytime. And so what they did is they set a precedent for attacking Jews. So the Amalek in Exodus, and then it's repeated again in Deuteronomy, is cursed that whenever you see an Amalekite, you have to kill them. To the effect that if an Amalekite walked into this room right now, as many of you know, the mitzvah is to kill them. No questions. If somebody walks in here and says, I'm Amalek, I don't wait for a second. I have to, according to the Torah, kill them.
And would the police buy that?
Probably not. Probably. It depends on what part of the country you live in. But I think in most parts of the country, you would, yes, pretty much it's not going to work. Now, who are the Amalekites today? We don't know of any Amalekites. There's nobody. The Amalekites disappeared as a people thousands of years ago. The only people that, like, there is no record the Amalekites ever existed. No archaeological evidence that there ever was an Amalek. That's how thoroughly they were wiped out or disappeared or whatever you want to say. There are no Amalekites. So we don't have to worry about that. However, there are definitely spiritual inheritors of the Amalekites, which is why the rabbis through the centuries said the Crusaders were Amalek, that the Inquisition was, well, we're going to get to that guy, but that the Nazis were Amalek, that Stalin was Amalek, that today's Hamas and Hezbollah are Amalek. So anyone who goes against the Jews in a genocidal campaign are considered Amalek, spiritually Amalek. Of course, that's a little politically tricky because if you identify someone as Amalek, you're basically saying it's a mitzvah to kill them. So it's a little bit charged in modern day Israel today when you call someone Amalek, because essentially you're consigning them to death. Yeah, Marcia.
Mark, I just looked it up on the internet because I'm a little confused. And it says of ancient nomadic tribe or collection of tribes described in the Old Testament as relentless enemies of Israel, even though they are closely related to Ephraim. So
Ephraim?
Isn't that what it says?
No, Edom.
Ephraim?
To Ephraim.
You don't get
No,
it.
that's a strange one from the
Then
internet.
it says here, one of the 12 tribes of Israel. They are among the nomadic raiders defeated by Gideon and were condemned annihilation by Samuel.
Yeah, there's no connection of them to the 12 tribes. The only way that they're related to us, which we'll actually see in a couple of weeks in our Genesis class, is according to Genesis chapter 36, they are descendants of Edom, that they're descendants of Esau. They're Esau's, they come off of Esau's grandson's line of people. Amalek is a descendant of Eliphaz, who's Esau's son. So he's Esau's grandson is Amalek, the ancestor of the Amalekites. Look, there is no, the rabbis in our minds, Amalek has always had a mythical existence. We only see them actually as people and like what they do in Exodus. Again, they are mentioned in Judges in the book of Gideon, that they're part of the Midianite and Amalek confederation that comes in and raids us, but we don't know of any of the people. Look, we don't get any names of any Amalekites, even in Exodus. We don't learn the name of any Amalekite. The only Amalekite that we ever are going to learn the name of, who's 100% Amalek, is this chapter right here. So this is the closest we get to actually see Amalek in person. Really, we actually get to meet an Amalekite, the only time. We're going to get to the part that Ronnie just said, which is the most famous Amalekite may or may not, I guess he could be part Amalekite, but we're going to get to that in a moment when we read about Amalek. So Saul is told, go to war against Amalek. You got to finish the business. These are our enemies. You got to finish the business that we have with them, going all the way back to Egypt, which was, again, 200 years ago. So the Amalekites got to be destroyed. So here's what happens.
Now go, attack Amalek and prescribe all that belongs to him. Spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and asses. Saul mustered the troops and enrolled them at Telaim, 200,000 men on foot and 10,000 men of Judah. Then Saul advanced as far as the city of Amalek and lay in wait in the wadi. Saul said to the Kenites, "Come, withdraw at once from among the Amalekites, that I may not destroy you along with them, for you showed kindness to all the Israelites when they left Egypt." So the Kenites withdrew from among the Amalekites.
So here we read that Saul attacks a city of Amalek, which we don't even know where the city of Amalek is, but it's the main area where they live, if you will. I mean, they're nomadic people, they're raiders, right? And so they don't normally live in a city, but I guess there was a headquarters or a place where they would go back to, a fortress, something like that. And they're about to attack. And Saul sends a message to some of the people that are living there, specifically, again, these people called Kenites. The Kenites we did read about earlier in the book of Joshua. They are a group of Midianite people, similar to the Amalekites. The Amalekites and the Midianites sometimes seem to be living amongst each other, as they did in the book of Joshua and the book of Judges. They seem to be living amongst each other. And what we know is that the Kenites, when Joshua came into the land, to refresh your memory, when Joshua and the people are attacking and kind of settling in the land of Canaan, the Kenites come out, and it's not Canaanites, the Kenites. It's actually closer to the name Cain, to Cain, of like Cain and Abel times. We don't know, by the way, that they are connected to Cain. I don't want to make that clear, but it's a similar name. Correct. But we don't know if that's why they're called Kenites, but they are nomadic peoples. They seem to be desert type people. But when Joshua came in, back in the book of Joshua, we read that the Kenites pretended to be Israelites. They pretended to be our brothers and said, "Don't attack us." And it turned out like we knew what they were. We didn't attack them. We said, no, it'll be cool. We'll leave you alone. And so the Kenites and the Israelites have this kind of pact. They're kind of allies. So what Saul does is says to the Kenites, "Hey, you guys are okay. You guys are good. You better get out of there right now. You better get out of where you are with the Amalekites, because we're about to destroy them." So what Saul does here seems to be really good, which, by the way, I mean, like, there's nothing bad about that. He's trying to save people he thinks are worth saving. Seems like he's good.
Tell a Kenite from an Amalekite.
He could tell, somebody could tell. Again, tribes within a tribe, within a tribal confederation, they could drop out. Look, I mean, how did a Benjaminite know they were a Benjaminite versus the rest of the Israelites? How did the Ephraimites, get pulled out? I mean, we read the story in Judges how they say the word shibboleth in versus sibboleth. Sometimes they had dialect, differences. They could hear the accent, or maybe again they dressed a certain way, but it was people could tell each other apart. Look, for us it's weird because I don't want to talk about it. It gets back to the Whoopi Goldberg business about how can you tell what somebody is, right? What race they are. Look, there were issues, and then this really happened. I mean, there were 15 years ago when we were in Iraq, we had relations. The U.S. government would support certain tribes in Iraq and not other tribes. Like, how did people know that somebody was Al Takriti versus a Bono? Somehow they knew. They knew. They identified themselves. They self-identified. They said, "Oh, I'm not part of that tribe." So, I mean, the tribalism in especially in the Middle East is still very much alive and well, and sometimes again makes a difference whether you live or die. So here,
baseball caps.
well, I will tell you, there is no question that Ronnie and Phyllis are from New York, right? And not even from New York, but from Brooklyn. I mean, and they lived in New Jersey for longer than they lived in Brooklyn. So, right?
Yes.
So there's no, we can tell that, Doreen is from Long Island. I mean, what?
I'm just, how?
Because do you want to go for coffee?
Like,
No, I mean, we know where people talk. You know, I mean, if you just pay attention a little bit, you can hear this person's from Chicago. Long Island. It's believe me, Long Island. Yeah. So we know where people are from, even in this country. And though of course it's dissipating a little bit our regional dialects, but you know we and by the way, the more you're in that area, the more you can tell, right? You know, like we just say, oh, that guy's got a Southern accent, but that guy goes, no, he's from South Carolina. That guy's from Alabama. That guy's from Texas. I mean, they'll know where they're from. We just hear a Southern drawl and we're going, oh, that guy's from the South. But again, it depends on where you live and what you can hear. So it was very possible that again, if you're an Amalekite, you know who's a Canaanite and who's an Amalekite. And maybe if you're from Judah or from Israel, you don't notice those differences as much, but they did. So that's how they knew. And the Kenites did, in fact, withdraw from the Amalekites. And here's what happens.
Saul destroyed Amalek from Havilah all the way to Shur, which is close to Egypt, and he captured King Agag of Amalek alive. He proscribed all the people, putting them to the sword. But Saul and the troops spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the second-born, the lambs, and all else that was of value. They would not proscribe them. They proscribed only what was cheap and worthless.
So Saul and his army did not pay attention to the directions. They did most of it. They killed most of everybody. They killed 99% of the people, but they kept one guy alive. They also did not kill and destroy all of the livestock, which they were supposed to do too, which seems a little excessive, but that was the direction. Everything was supposed to be wiped out. They were supposed to be like no at all remembrance that these people ever existed. No legacy, no piece of anything that they have. But Saul decided not to do that. What really happened with his decision, we are going to see his explanation. So I'm not going to tell you yet, and we will discuss it in a second. But he did not follow directions. Again, we said this last week, there definitely seems to be a severe bias against King Saul. So anything he does wrong is going to be really, really important. And unfortunately, we only learn about what he does wrong. And even here, where there's this great victory, he finally defeats and literally wipes out this enemy that we were supposed to have been wiped out for the last 200 years. Joshua didn't do it. None of the judges did it. Nobody did it until King Saul. He wipes out everybody except for one person.
The word of the Lord then came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from me and has not carried out my commands. Samuel was distressed, and he entreated the Lord all night long.
One second.
Okay.
One of the lights is flickering. It's bugging me. Okay.
Yeah.
Still there. Bye-bye, light. You're okay.
Early in the morning, Samuel went to meet Saul. Samuel was told Saul went to Carmel, where he erected a monument for himself. Then he left and went on down to Gilgal. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord. I have fulfilled the Lord's command."
Right. So Samuel knows that Saul hasn't done what he was supposed to do. Right? God tells him. Notice the first thing that Saul says when he sees Samuel is, "I have fulfilled the Lord's command." That's the first thing he says. Well, he says, "Blessed are you of the Lord." So Saul's very excited, which again, if this scene didn't happen, it's definitely embellished in a way that somebody imagined it happened, which is that Saul is very excited about his success. And what is he about to find?
"Then what?" demanded Samuel. "Is this bleating of sheep in my ears and the lowing of oxen that I hear?" Saul answered, they were brought from the Amalekites, for the troops spared the choicest of the sheep and oxen for sacrificing to the Lord your God, and we prescribed the rest.
What God?
So what is Saul's answer? What is his answer?
Oh,
Ronnie, say it.
Your God.
Yeah, he doesn't say our God. He doesn't say my God.
I like what
He says,
Samuel says.
Your God, right? So yes. So Samuel says the evidence that you didn't do what you were supposed to do is all around us. I can hear it. And so Saul's answer was, which is a logical answer. Yeah, we're going to sacrifice him to God, your God, but whatever. We're sacrificing him to God, the God that told us to do all this. We decided we are going to save. We didn't keep them for ourselves. We're not going to eat them. We're not going to sell them, but we're sacrificing them as a way of saying thank you to God. So that is Saul's answer.
Your answer, because you kill him when you sacrifice.
Exactly. I'm going to kill them. I'm not keeping them. I'm not getting rich off of them. I'm giving them back to God.
Samuel said to Saul, stop. Let me tell you what the Lord said to me last night. Speak, he replied. And Samuel said, you may look small to yourself, but you are the head of the tribes of Israel. The Lord anointed you king over Israel. And the Lord sent you on a mission, saying, go and proscribe the sinful Amalekites, make war on them until you have exterminated them. Why did you disobey the Lord and swoop down on the spoil in defiance of the Lord's will?
So he says to him, you were told what to do and you didn't do it. You disobeyed God. You disobeyed God.
Saul said to Samuel, but I did obey the Lord. I performed the mission on which the Lord sent me. I captured King Agag of Amalek and I proscribed Amalek. And the troops took from the spoil some sheep and oxen.
Hello.
The
Hello.
what had been proscribed
Hello.
to sacrifice to the Lord God at Gilgal.
Who is this? Susie?
Okay, hold it a second. Hold it a second.
Go ahead.
I have to.
You have a cold from
Yes.
right beyond.
So
Yeah.
hold it a second. I
Doing
apologize.
better.
Let me mute. That's Philip. So let
Hold
me. I will
Hold on.
mute.
What?
Sorry about that. He didn't know. Anyways, so what we have here is a difference of opinion on what had happened, right? I captured and I killed everything else. And again, I kept this stuff again to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal. And it's pretty much the same thing he said before, except now he says where he's going to do it. But he's still calling him Lord your God. He's not saying Lord my God. It is interesting that he doesn't claim him as his God. He's using the same Lord your God, which is reminiscent a little bit of Jacob when Jacob was referring to God to Isaac, saying your God. It is interesting when someone doesn't want to say my God.
Or just God.
Or just God, but we would have to say, yeah. Well, yeah, it would have to. I'm just trying to think if there's ever Lord my God or Lord, or whether it would be Lord our God or your God. I don't know if there's ever just God. Probably. I don't know if this early, but the point is that Saul is not taking responsibility that he's not admitting any fault. He's not admitting that he did anything wrong. God never said take Agag hostage. He never said that. He didn't say that. He said kill everything. Kill everything. That's what God's command was. Again, is this a trick? Is this to see whether Saul will obey? But there is that sense of what Samuel says, which is, he says to him, you may look small to yourself, but you're head of the tribes of Israel. So he says to him, you may think that this isn't a big deal, but it's a big deal because you're in charge and you set the example for everybody else. Now, what's interesting about that is that he says, you may look small to yourself, which is a weird thing to say because Saul, as we already know physically, was head and shoulders bigger than everybody. That's actually what it says. A head bigger than everybody. He's a tall guy, but he's obviously here talking spiritually, emotionally, that Saul doesn't have a really good sense of self-esteem,
Right.
which is actually, according to some of what we know about narcissists, that they actually have really bad self-esteem. And they are constantly, as the article I was just reading yesterday says, constantly looking for validation. So is there something about Saul, which we're reading about, which is really about his own desire to make himself feel better by doing something that he wasn't told to do in the first place?
He was an unlikely candidate to be king in the first place. And he probably thought of himself as an unlikely candidate to be king.
Yeah. Now remember, he didn't start out poor. His tribe, as we know, the Benjaminites are like the smallest tribe, but we don't know much about, again, he doesn't seem to have been the most likely candidate. Though I will tell you, that's what we're going to see in our next king in just a few verses, unlikely candidates. But what happens here is that God essentially says, I made a mistake. I picked the wrong guy. And Samuel's initial reaction is, oh no, because it says Samuel was distressed. It says that Samuel was upset when God comes to him and says, we made a mistake. Not we made a mistake, I made a mistake. But it also implies that God can make a mistake. God literally didn't know what Saul was going to do.
Is there any regret between this and the first one, which is back in Genesis, when God says he regrets that he made people?
It's a good question because when we get into this big theological question of whether God makes a mistake, the word here is nichamti, right? Nichamti. Ki him lachti, which, by the way, he says, God says, I regret, I made Saul king. He doesn't say they made him king, or they asked. I mean, there's nothing, we made him king. It's I. So what's great about that question that she just asked is that we can also go immediately back to the story of creation, and we can see what it says at the very beginning. And
Part of the story.
but we'll see what he actually says.
Yeah, here he is.
So when we go, you can see it says Vayinachem Adonai. It's the same word. When it says that God regretted having made humankind, it's the same word, nicham, the same root. So it says that God has regrets. And so when people say, well, theologically, is it possible for God to make a mistake or God to have things that don't go the way that God wants them to? Well, there's...
If free will is part of the gift that God gave us, then the answer is yes.
Yeah. And having God now see what happens with Saul when he's actually put into action means that, again, contrary to maybe you'd call it Greek theology or Greek myths, human beings have a lot of power, and they even have the power to make God regret the way things happen. And to the effect that now something has to be done, and you can't undo it. He can't. I mean, you can say, well, can't God turn back time and make something else happen? This has to now play out the way it's going to play out. And so let's see what happens here. So again, the back and forth, Saul is not taking responsibility. Actually, on the contrary, he says, I thought I did the right thing. So he doesn't even say, oh, I made a mistake. He says, I thought I did what was right. We're gonna do what God wants. We're gonna burn everything. And I'm actually gonna burn the stuff up for God. And here's what Samuel says to him.
But Samuel said, Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obedience to the Lord's command? Surely obedience is better than sacrifice, compliance than the fat of rams. For rebellion is like the sin of divination, defiance like the iniquity of teraphim. Because you rejected the Lord's command, he has rejected you as king.
Wow. So
You're fired.
yeah, God doesn't want sacrifices. God wants people to listen. And you have proven yourself unworthy, and you have not listened to God. And so God will reject you. You've rejected God, you will be rejected. So it's a very poetic, biblical poetry style. Everything is repeated,
Sounds like
Instead of-
Isaiah a bit.
What was that?
I said it sounds a bit like Isaiah.
Yeah, right. Isaiah is that section that we read at Yom Kippur, right? Is it do I want you to sacrifice, and do I want you to fast, or do I want you to take care of people? There it's a little bit different because he's talking to everybody, Isaiah, and he's talking about, well, I mean, you could say he's talking to everybody here too, right? This is a message not just for Saul, but for everybody, but maybe every king, but every human being. Could be. But yeah, in Isaiah, it's clearly to everybody. And it's really a message of not so much listening to God, but taking care of other people, right? Because in Isaiah, as Rosemary's saying, he says, do I want you to fast, or do I want you to afflict yourself on this day? Or do I want you to go out and make sure that poor people have a place to live, and, that there aren't people suffering in your midst? And so that's even, again, more on your behavior towards other people. And so here it's all in relation to God. Do I want you to do sacrifices, or do I want you to listen to me when I tell you what you have to do? So again, Saul is punished here for not doing what he is supposed to do. As I also said last week, Saul gets punished, it seems, disproportionately in some ways. It reminds us a little bit about Moses, right? Striking the rock.
What is the iniquity of the teraphim?
So that's an interesting, so the word right here, teraphim, and notice right here, idols, consulted for oracles. And it says, look at Ezekiel and Zechariah. But we also can look back at Genesis, and we also can look ahead to some of what's going to happen with Saul. Teraphim are like household idols. How are they different than other idols? It's a good question, but they probably were personal idols as opposed to communal idols, in the sense that idols that were statues that were in public spheres, or poles, or different cultic ritual sites that were public sites. Teraphim were things that you brought into your house. The question of how big they were, well, in the story of Rachel and Jacob, they're small enough that she can put them underneath her.
Saddlebags.
They're, in the bags, right? And she refuses to show her dad the fact that she stole Laban's. She told her, we're about to read it in our Wednesday night class. We're about to read how Rachel steals her father's idols, his teraphim. And then we're going to read about a teraphim, a teraph, the singular. In just a couple of chapters, we're going to read about a teraph that our mother Rachel's great granddaughter, many times, 10 times, 7 times or so, removed. Michal uses a teraph as well. But that teraph is at least big enough to be the size of a mannequin, be the size of a guy. So it doesn't mean that teraphim were always tiny. They seem to be, at least sometimes they could be mistaken for a person. So maybe if you're a king, because remember, Michal is a princess, so maybe she had big household idols. But it also tells us that Saul, in addition, when we get to that, Saul had teraphim too. So it's not good. It's not good to have teraphim. There are theories that they were not always gods or goddesses, that sometimes they represented ancestors, which they do in Asia and other parts of the world. They have statues to represent our ancestors. That's probably bigger than a rabbit's foot, but it's not good. And it is, by the way, paralleled with divination, which is kesem, which is witchcraft, sorcery. Maybe augury too, but the word kesem is oftentimes a grab bag for lots of different kind of divination. Probably not astrology as much as casting spells and those kind of things. All right, so they're not good, and they're not things that we're supposed to do. And they're paralleled with rebellion and defiance. And so here's what he says.
Saul said to Samuel, I did wrong to transgress the Lord's command and your instructions, but I was afraid of the troops and I yielded to them. Please forgive my offense and come back with me, and I will bow low to the Lord. But Samuel said to Saul, I will not go back with you, for you have rejected the Lord's command, and the Lord has rejected you as king over Israel.
Yeah. So Doreen, can you close it? Can you close it? I don't think anyone else. Thank you. So Saul says no, essentially the same thing. You're done. You've been rejected. You rejected God, and you've now been rejected as king. Same words. You're done. And because Saul finally admits his mistake. He says, I did wrong. I screwed up. He says, just come back. Come back and I'll humble myself before God. I'll bow. That's what the words. I'll bow low. I'll get down on the ground and I'll bow before God. And I screwed up. Now, of course, when he says he screwed up, he didn't just say he screwed up. He says, I listened to the troops. The troops wanted to do it. They made me do it. So he doesn't really take full responsibility. Not that it probably would have made a difference, but he doesn't really take responsibility. But he also shows himself not a very good leader. If his answer is, I had to listen to what the troops were saying, it also shows that he did not have good leadership skills if he was afraid of the troops. So it does not, no matter what, he's done. And that's what Samuel says. You're done. There's no more. You're done. You're out of here. You're finished. And it seems as though Saul, again, however he screwed up, he now at least somewhat admits his fault. But it seems as though Samuel now, who we heard at the beginning, was not looking forward to this mission of taking him away and taking him out, is now he doesn't go, well, let me check back with God. He seems pretty resolute. He seems pretty much like it's over. It's a really powerful scene. Just keep it in mind. You know, whoever you want to have play Saul and Samuel. I think the last version of this I saw on screen, Samuel's being played by Leonard Nimoy.
Oh, I remember that one.
Leonard Nimoy. It's one of the few times that this scene has ever been acted out. And he's telling him.
What movie is that?
What?
What movie is that?
The one on King David.
Ah,
That was not the Richard Gere King David. It was a King David movie on TBS. And it was pretty good. It had some good parts. And it also had some parts that we don't usually see acted out. This is a very dramatic scene. And I love it being acted out. So act it out in your mind. Have it acted out in your mind. Whoever you want to have Samuel be, obviously is an older guy, and Saul's a younger guy, big guy, strong guy. Maybe a Russell Crowe. I don't know. Maybe taller than Russell Crowe. Some guy. I'll tell you. An English guy, I think, or Australian. But it was, however you want to have this scene go, it's not over. The drama is not over. There's scenes that are dramatic in the Bible, and they usually involve something like this.
Well, I also remember Saul's son went against him before.
Jonathan, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And then this happened, so he's like,
He can't catch a break. Watch this scene.
as Samuel turned to leave, Saul seized the corner of his robe and it tore. And Samuel said to him, The Lord has this day torn the kingship over Israel away from you and has given it to another who is worthier than you. Moreover, the glory of Israel does not deceive or change his mind, for he is not human that he should change his mind.
Now, that is interesting because
God changes his mind all the
he
time.
did seem to just change his mind. Well, there definitely is a different changing of the mind. Maybe changing the mind again. Like God definitely changed or regretted, but God doesn't change back. That's not really, we don't believe that, by the way. Because every year at Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, we pray that God will rescind any bad judgments against us, right? So we pray that God will indeed relent and not have those judgments against us. By the way, this David movie came out in 1985. Man, that was a long time ago. Jonathan Pryce was in it too.
Hmm.
He's a good actor.
T-shirts from 1985. What are you talking about?
I'm just saying it's longer ago than I want to admit. That was 37 years ago. So tell me, take me back through what's so powerful about this scene of his garment getting ripped and then people, like, what do you see in this scene? What do you see?
The ultimate humiliation
Okay.
is when anybody's uniform or whatever, things are ripped off, or their sleeves, or if there's something like that that they used to do. It's the ultimate humiliation. Not only are you let go, but now the world sees it too.
Yep. So give me some other ones where you've seen clothes getting ripped.
When someone dies.
Yep. 100% when someone dies. What else? When have we seen it in the Bible?
Well, Joseph's coat.
Yep. Right. So when Joseph's coat gets ripped by the brothers and they bring it back and say, your son was killed, right? What else is interesting about this Samuel's garment being ripped? Of course, again, being ripped, it's a symbol of the kingdom now being ripped from you.
I mean, Saul's desperate enough to grab Samuel's garment, and the metaphor of his desperation gets turned back on him. Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
You tore my robe? Well, you're torn away from the kingship.
Yeah, it's a very dramatic scene. Tell me something about Samuel and his cloak. For those that remembered a few weeks ago. Do you remember remember how Samuel came to live with Eli? His mother Hannah promised him, dedicated him to God, right? And once he's old enough, she takes him to Eli, drops him off and says, he's now God's. I promised him, and now he's going to serve you and serve God, right? But every year she would come up and visit him and bring him a robe. This is the robe, maybe the last robe his mom made him. This is his outer garment. This is his robe, if you will, that is his robe. Like, he's known by that robe. And that robe, to some extent, could be, we don't know for sure, but that last robe, we would assume.
Wow, I mean, that's a pretty miraculous robe if it's the same one that his mom made for him.
Well, she made a new one for him every year, right? So let's say we don't know when Hannah died, right? We don't know when Hannah died. Hannah could have died 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But at some point she stops making them robes because she can't make a robe anymore. She either can't sew anymore, or she's dead.
Yeah.
The point is that this dude has a robe that's very special to him, perhaps, which is the robes that his mom made him. And that robe just got ripped. And for Samuel, that's the last straw. Now, again, we don't know for a fact that this was one that his mom made. Maybe he was done long ago with those robes, but maybe, just maybe, that robe that was so important, that was Samuel's distinctive marker that everybody knew about him, has now been ripped. And for him, he says, this is it. This is it. Yours is ripped. And now, not only does he say, it's over for you, he says to him, it's now been given to someone else more worthy than you. And at this point, what's going through Saul's mind? Because up until this point, maybe he's thinking, well, it's over, but maybe the whole kingship's over. I'm the first king. Maybe God's done with the king. Maybe we're done. Maybe this experiment of kings is over. I could live with that, right? I could live with the fact that my time's over, if that's it. But are you telling me that there's now going to be someone to take my place and they're better than me? Nobody wants to hear that. Nobody wants to hear that. Now, we're lucky in this country because our first president turned out to be one of the best, maybe arguably the best president, right? We're lucky. So we started off with a really good person who ended up helping create an institution that was important, real important, and it grew in power. But this is not what's happening right now. This first king is ruling for a fairly short period of time before he's already being told, you're done. And in the back of his mind, he knows there's someone out there now who's better than him, who's more worthy to be the king than him. And this could very well drive you nuts. And it seems that it does. It seems that knowledge that someone out there is better fit to be king than he is going to drive this guy nuts, literally,
Yeah, I mean, typically,
clinically. Nuts.
typically, if there's, if there's a new leader before the old leader dies, the new leader's going to kill him.
That is part of it too. But there's an existential issue here that affects him, because if you're told that God's making you king and now God is unmaking you king, that's bad. But to be told that there's now somebody who's better than you at doing the job that you're supposed to do, that's really hard. It's really hard for people. Look, it's really hard for people. I mean, all of us can go back to a point in time, hopefully not many, where somebody ended up coming in and doing a better job than we did at something. Now, some of those things we maybe don't care about because, it wasn't important to us in the first place. But this is pretty important to Saul. And he has a chance to be the first king, and he blew it. But I mean, look, it happens to people all the time in relationships, I mean, especially with relationships, especially.
Level of competence.
Yeah, especially the confidence, but especially like think about in marriages.
Mhm.
Think about when somebody gets remarried, and think about the feeling that they have when they know that somebody else is living with their ex-spouse. And if they see that person's happier with the other person, I mean, sometimes they don't care, but sometimes they really care. And I don't want everyone to feel sad for Saul. He screwed up, but we can at least feel sympathy for him. We can at least understand the human feelings of inadequacy and what happens to a person when they feel not only that they screwed up, that they lost their job, but that the person that's going to get their job is definitively better than them. Because it doesn't say, God doesn't say, I'm going to get another king. I'm going to get another king, and the king is more worthy than you. So there's no question. When somebody else takes our job, sometimes or takes our position, it's a subjective decision. Well, they think he's better, but I know I'm better. And by the way, there's people who live in this delusion all the time, right? Everybody knows you didn't do as good a job. I mean, it happens all the time. I mean, just ask Timothy Dalton with his James Bond, Timothy Dalton's a good actor, but nobody liked him as James Bond. And then the next guy came in and they were like, oh, he's so much better. And then the next guy came in and he's even better than him. But I mean, in seriousness, but that's a subjective decision. That we're joking about that. When God makes a decision and tells you that this person's better than you, there's no argument. There's no, well, that's your opinion, God. God said that person's a better king than you. Better, no question, not subjective. It is done. So this is what this guy just heard. It's terrible. It's a terrible moment in this guy's life. I would argue that almost as bad as being told you're dead, you're going to die. And we all know we're going to die. But being told you're dead is being told that you are not good at what you were supposed to do, and that there's someone walking around out there who's better than you.
Right? Because after all is King David. I mean, let's not.
That's interesting because when I did martial arts, we were told there's always going to be somebody better than you.
well, Rosemary.
Me personally, but everybody.
Yeah, I understand, but not that this is different. This
Yeah.
is now God. So, Ronnie, what were you saying?
I mean, not looking at it from Saul's point of view, but I mean, we're the readers, right? And after all, this is King David, the guy who's gonna, sire the Messiah. So,
Yeah, but we know that. Saul doesn't know that, and Saul doesn't care. This is the whole issue of what happens to Saul in our minds, because Saul is always going to be the guy who was the first king who didn't live up to his. I mean, everyone who reads the Bible is left with a King Saul that is inadequate.
Flunked his-
Pretty depressing if God tells you you're not up to the job.
didn't live
I
up
mean,
to
I
it.
can't think of anything worse than that.
I think it's pretty much, to me, it's literally worse than being told you're going to die, because you're basically being told that your existence in this world is inadequate.
Yeah. I mean, God is telling him, you're a loser.
Yep. And by the way, just so you know, it was Jonathan Pryce who actually played King Saul in that biblical epic. So Jonathan Pryce, I knew it was an English guy. It was Jonathan Pryce played Saul. He's what? And by the way, it came out in 97. The King David with Richard Gere came out in 85. So I don't feel quite as bad that it feels like it wasn't that long ago. The King David one is a good one to watch. Nathaniel Parker, who played David, is not a big actor. Leonard Nimoy played Samuel. Cheryl Lee, who we haven't seen in ages, she was in Twin Peaks. She played Bathsheba. And no one else big that you really know was in it. Though Franco Nero played great Italian actor. Franco Nero played the prophet Nathan in that. But it was, it's worth watching. I mean, if you've never seen the David that was done as part of that Bible collection, some of those Bible ones were really good. The Abraham one with Richard Harris was phenomenal. The one with Matthew Modine as Jacob was not as good because it was not a great Jacob, but it had some good roles. But the Ben Kingsley, it wasn't Ben Kingsley, he was in it, but Ben Kingsley was the Moses in the Moses one. But Ben Kingsley had a role as Potiphar in the Joseph one. The Joseph one was phenomenal. I think that one might have been the best one. It was Joseph, and Joseph was played by Paul Mercurio, played Joseph, and but Ben Kingsley played Potiphar, and Leslie Ann Warren played Potiphar's wife, and Martin Landau played Jacob.
Valerie, where do you find some of these movies? to watch? Or-
Those ones, it's a very good question.
Okay, I'll start it.
You know what? I don't know. I'm tempted to contact them and somehow get the rights to show those on JLTV. I will tell you that they were done on TBS. They were shown on TBS. The DVDs are all available. But yeah, it's hard to find. Not all of them were good. Not all of the Bible ones that they did were good. They were joint American, Italian, and I think German productions. And some of them were really good. And The King David one that was done was actually a little bit more to the Bible. The King David one everyone remembers was the one with Richard Gere. And the problem with that one was that Richard Gere completely overacted in that one, and probably could have, if someone had reined him in, probably could have done a really good job with that. But it unfortunately was part of a lot of Bible movies that people have made that have not been great. It's very hard to do Bible movies, and it hurt. You know, it's tough, and people don't even want to deal with it because you're almost starting from a negative once you go into it. So it's really hard to do. Anyways, this is a very dramatic scene. Samuel, it should be acted out though, with Samuel turning around and looking at him going, "You're done. And just as you tore this has been torn from you."
Rabbi,
Yes.
I'm looking on, it looks like YouTube has one. King David 1997.
That's
full
it.
movie.
Yeah. How much is it on YouTube?
I think it's free.
No,
Wait, hold on.
it's not free.
Let me go further. Let me go. Hold on a second. I gotta get rid of
So Marcia said it's on YouTube. I'm sure a lot of this is on YouTube. I just don't think it's free, but I don't think it'll be very expensive, but
I'm looking here.
okay. So she's going to look that up. Saul's not over. Samuel's not over, by the way. Let's read the way this scene is.
Yeah, it's not showing me any fees.
All right. We'll look for it, folks. I'll post a link. What?
Orlando Karate?
Yeah.
1997?
It's playing? Marcia is playing it for free on YouTube. So I'll post a link. King David, 1997. All righty. All right. So Saul's not finished.
So Samuel followed Saul back, and Saul bowed low to the Lord. Samuel said, "Bring forward to me King Agag of Amalek." Agag approached him with faltering steps, and Agag said, "Bitter death is at hand." Samuel said, "As your sword has bereaved women, so shall your mother be bereaved among women." And Samuel cut Agag down before the Lord at Gilgal.
Wow. Wow. So that is a dramatic scene. Because the guy that actually kills the last Amalekite is Samuel, not Saul. He doesn't let Saul kill him. He kills him himself. And that whole scene is crazy because the only time we ever hear from an Amalekite ever is that line, "Bitter death is at hand." And again, if you look at the note, it says, the meaning of the Hebrew is uncertain. It seems to be like some kind of idiom, which is, "I'm about to die." And he doesn't just kill him. He gives him a little poem at the end too, a final death poem, which is, "Just as your sword has caused women to weep," right? Has caused them to mourn their husbands and families. Your mother is now going to be bereaved.
So he's not the last Amalekite. His mother's still alive.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there seems to be this idea that his mom's still alive, which is interesting, right? Is he literally speaking about his mother in
Amalekite.
poetic terms? What?
I said, maybe his mother's not an Amalekite.
Oh, interesting. Rosemary's going midrashic on this, which is that what happens to him. There's another issue, my friends, which is he the last Amalekite? Is he the last Amalekite? Now, it seems as though he's the last Amalekite. The Bible seems to not be 100% clear here. But as Ronnie has pointed out, and as we know from the Tanakh, and since we have this great feature that we can actually jump around and show you different parts of the Bible at any time that we would like, let's jump ahead. That was pretty quick, right? Everyone looks. Chapter 3 of the book of Esther. Sometime afterwards, King Ahasuerus promoted, it's a month away, Haman. Boo, you have to boo. Son of Hamadatha, the Agagite. The Agagite. Now, it doesn't call him an Amalekite. Interestingly, it calls him
Agag.
Agagite. Yes, it says Ha'agagi, which by the way is an interesting construct. It doesn't say he's B'nai Agag, which is oftentimes the when we say an ait at the end, it means the son of, or he's from the tribe. He actually is called an Agagi. But remember, the book of Esther is a fairly late book of the Bible. But it calls him an Agagite, which means, again, maybe not an Amalekite anymore, but we refer to these people as the Agagites. Well, how did that happen? How do we have an Agagite? They're no longer referred to Amalek, but maybe again, they're a substratum of the Amalekites. So the rabbis get a little creative here. Yes, Ronnie, you're going to say something.
You know, Agag, the king, Agagite, I mean, that's the connection.
Seems it's the same guy, right? It seems as though logic would tell us it's the same guy. We don't know for sure, but it does seem to be who's referred to here as King Agag. So the rabbis get a little creative here. And they want to teach a lesson, of course, which is when God tells you to do something, you do it. You don't ask questions. You don't get creative. You don't say, let me take matters into my own hands and do a little bit of, I'll fix God's instruction, make it even better. No, just listen to God and do what God says. Because what does Saul do by preserving him in life and letting him live a couple extra days? What does he do? King Agag gets somebody pregnant while he's under house arrest, if you will. In those few days that he was supposed to have been killed, he gets somebody pregnant. Well, friends, exactly. 500 years later, we get a Haman. So what's the lesson, right? You never know what will happen. God knows what will happen. God knows that Haman can come along. So if Haman has his way, all the Jews are destroyed. And why are all the Jews destroyed? Because Saul didn't pay attention. That's the consequence. So this is the old, what happens if you have a chance to kill baby Hitler? Or Hitler's great-great-grandparent? Wow. So now that's what that midrash is. That midrash is God has to fix this because there's a legacy that is left behind. And to some extent, how many other Hamans are out there? Because King Agag was given a chance to procreate. Because again, if 500 years later, 600 years later, whatever, there's now a Haman running around, how many Haman cousins are there? And how many Haman cousins now are running around 2,500 years later? So this gets to be a mythic battle between the Jews and the Amalekites. It's a good comic book. Patent pending. I don't know. But it's a great mythic story. It really is. And by the way, guys, it gets even better. Gets even better. Because Saul is from what tribe, folks? Benjamin. And the heroes of our story of Esther, Marcia, who's the hero of the story of Esther? Mordecai and Esther.
Yeah, Esther would be my guess.
Not a trick question.
Yeah, no.
What tribe are Mordecai and Esther from? Benjamin. They're Benjaminites. They're Benjaminites living in Persia, which means people still knew they were from the tribe of Benjamin hundreds of years later in exile. The tribe of Benjamin then went into exile with Judah, and they're living in Persia 300 or so BCE. They're living in Persia. And so what do the descendants of Benjamin do? They've got to clean up. They've got to clean up their ancestor Saul's mistake. Yeah, Mordecai and Esther are part of a mythic cosmic battle between Jews
Haman
and
his people then truly, when they die, they're the last.
We don't know.
Because he could have had more children.
Could have had Haman, well, Haman's kids, you're right, all get
Yeah,
they all
we're
get
talking about Saul.
crucified at the
His
end.
sons.
His sons, yes,
12 sons.
sons. His sons get crucified at the end. 10, he has 10.
10.
But that's another weird story. But by the time that Haman existed, how many other Hamans are there? Right? That's only the Haman in Persia. What if there's a Haman in Greece? What if there's a Haman in America? What if there's a Haman all around the world? It's the descendants of the Benjaminites that have to make sure that those Hamans get wiped out. Yeah.
You know, the problem, just the general problem of like bad blood. In other words, God believes, you know, what your ancestors are, that's who you are. period. And
That's an
all-
interesting, well, no, that's an interesting question. So Cheryl says, is there a genetic component to being bad, right? If you're a descendant of these people,
4
Now-
generations.
what?
4 generations.
Well, for 4 generations, I don't know.
Like 10 generations.
I don't know if you're good. When does it go out of your blood? Now, here's the weird thing, Cheryl, based on genetics and based on what we would know about the numerical probability of genetics, and you go back 2,000 years to Persia and the Middle East, back to Judea and Amalek and everything else, if that's the case, there are a lot of people running around today with both the blood of the Benjaminites and the blood of the Amalekites within them. So if you want to get really mythic, the struggle goes on inside of us because we have both sides. There's no way, probability wise, we wouldn't have blood of Amalek then in us too. So that's a possibility that, again, by this point, we all have a little bit, which is actually what the rabbi said 2,000 years ago. During the time of the Second Temple, during the time, again, contemporary with Jesus, the rabbis say, we don't know who's who. Don't tell us what tribe or what ethnicity you are, because everyone's mixed up. And they said that they said that in the Talmud. In the Talmud, they said, the blood is so mixed up by this point, we don't know who's an Ammonite, we don't know who's an Israelite or a Judite or a Benjaminite. It's all mixed up. We just don't have the records. And they said, you can't come to us and tell us that. And so essentially it was useless. What's interesting now, Cheryl, is we have the technology to actually pick this apart. Now, we don't exactly have the information yet, and I won't say we never will have it, to actually say who's an Amalekite. We definitely have the DNA to prove who's a Jew. Whether we want to, and by the way, the rabbis have said, contemporary rabbis have said, DNA cannot prove your Judaism. You can't go into a mikveh or into a court for a conversion and say, I'm Jewish already, I don't need to convert, but make me a Jew, say I'm Jewish. You can't do that
Why is that?
because the rabbi said 2,000 years ago, we don't know. And they're not going to take a blood test, because what happens if in 50 years we know even more and we invalidate some of what we said based on the science today? So the only way you can prove it is to go through a conversion and to say, or to have proof that you're Jewish already. So if you have proof you're Jewish already by a ketubah, by a birth certificate, by something that shows that were recognized as a Jew, and you're a Jew, they're not going to deny you're a Jew. But if you come and say, well, I don't know that I'm Jewish, but my DNA test says I'm Jewish, it's not recognized.
That's really interesting.
Now, by the way, the most Orthodox even courts today would, not most, not all, most, many, I don't know how many, depends on where you are, I guess, would say, look, if you come to us and you have Jewish ancestry, we'll make it easier for you. We'll encourage you to do this. We want you to do this. They won't say, don't bother, but they won't say you're automatically Jewish because your DNA says you're Jewish.
Oh, interesting. Philip is adopted, and he just very recently, in the last 2 years, found out that both of his parents were Jewish. And he did do his DNA, and it definitely came up, but that's interesting. So he would still have to go through a conversion.
Well,
Oh,
yeah, tell them who Philip is.
Oh, I'm sorry, Philip is Alex's boyfriend. And it's funny, his mother's Native Hawaiian, so Native Hawaiian and Jewish. I mean, it's a fascinating story,
Like West Troy.
you know?
So Marcia says, this does happen. Look, if they had proof of who the mother was and knew the mother's
Yeah.
birth and could prove it, then they wouldn't have to go. So it's not the father, obviously, in the Orthodox world, it would be the mother, showing the mothers.
She is practicing Orthodox right now, in Hawaii.
So,
It's an interesting story.
so if you have, to get to Cheryl's original point, the blood is definitely a part of who we are, right? We recognize that our blood and our ethnicity is a big part of who we are, but it's not reduced to it. And there is this recognition at the end of the day that we're all human beings. And one of the reasons that the Bible tells us at the beginning that we're all children of Adam and Eve is, as the rabbis say in the Talmud, so that nobody can say that my ancestors are better than your ancestors, is exactly for that reason. So we're careful with what we say about genetics. It's a very interesting point, and as already laid out, and we'll talk about it more on the Wednesday night class, maybe when we get to Esau in a couple weeks. Amalek is a descendant of Esau, which means that at some point he was a descendant of Abraham. So he wasn't that far removed. There's actually a wonderful midrash about it, which I was going to share on Wednesday night, but now I have to share it because of this discussion. You never know what's going to happen. So here's the midrash is very simple. When Eliphaz, who is Esau's son, marries his concubine or takes his concubine, name is Timnah, they have a baby. That's Amalek. But there's a midrash that Timnah actually went to Jacob and said, I want to become a Jew. And he says, no. So what does she do? She says, if I can't be a Jew, if I can't be a B'nai Yaakov, B'nai Yisrael, I'm going to marry the next best thing. I'm going to marry into Esau's family because at least he's close. Well, she does. And her child ends up being Amalek, our enemy. And so what the rabbis say is because of our inability to accept this person, they end up being the mother, the unknowingly, I mean, she didn't do it on purpose, but we kicked her out and she ended up being the ancestor of Amalek. And so the Midrash tells us that the value of making sure we're not turning people away who could wind up inadvertently becoming our own worst, that we could be our own worst enemy. But we didn't know that, and she ended up becoming our enemy. So it's an interesting midrash. I mean, again, it's a midrash, but the lesson from it is essentially you do this at your own peril. Yeah.
So my question is kind of more global, not if you're Jewish or not Jewish, but some, like in contemporary times, saying your family, they're no good, so you must not be good, but accepting every person who they are.
Yes. Well, I will tell you, there's another interesting lesson from the Bible on that, Cheryl. And the rabbis also point out, we have lists of kings. David will have a son, and his son will be king, and his next son will be king, and his son will be king. And the rabbis notice a pattern that oftentimes the son of a good king turns out to be a schmuck. Really bad. I mean, worse than that. What's even worse than a schmuck? I don't even want to use other words. So those words, they're worse than that. And but then the weird thing is then that guy's son turns out to be good. And so they say we never know. The son of a bad king can be great, and the son of a good king can be bad. So you can never know for sure. And that's one of the other things that the rabbis say is that yes, there is something to be said for your yichus, as we say, your ancestry, but it's not a guarantee.
Right, I'm glad they.
Oh, no, there's 100% recognition because the Bible shows you. It doesn't mean that you're going to be good. If you can get 2 or 3 generations in a row that are good, that's already that's a big deal. That's a machaya. What?
It's interesting though when you talk about genetics, because, and of course they didn't do this back in the day, but you do see genetic predispositions to alcoholism, to the things
Yes.
that would lead to not being good.
Well, don't say not being good, but to have challenges.
Whatever, okay, however you want
Yeah,
to say it.
don't-
On the other- you know what I mean? You're
Yes.
talking about, blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, though, behavior is learned. So if you're the son of these kings and how they raise you has some input, right? The world changes. So you're right. If you can perpetuate that.
Yeah,
would be interesting.
it's harder than we'd like to admit. And we're not going to rely on either one. We're not going to rely on genetics, and we're not going to rely on the fact that parents seem to be good people. They seem to have taught their kids everything that they should to be good people, but yet they still aren't good people.
But I could tell you a lot of people today that I think are the most incredible parents and their kids are. just-
Yes, and vice versa.
Correct.
And vice versa. So the Bible tells us it's no guarantee. It's not any reason to give up, obviously. But even with our best intentions, even with our best genetics, there's no guarantee. Absolutely.
So the thing I most don't understand about Sam and Saul is what happened to teaching and forgiveness? There seemed to not be that. He was asked to do something, he didn't do it, and they killed him. Where was the? what's
Well, they
the
didn't kill
issue
him.
about-
They didn't kill him. They took away his, they cast him out. He's done. Well, remember, there have already been a couple of scenes already where he didn't do what he was supposed to do.
Yeah.
So he seems to be impulsive. He seems to do what he wants to do. There definitely seems to be, there's a problem though, Marcia, which is that that's all we get about Saul. We only get the negative, which is again, makes sense if the person who wrote this or edited it more likely is part of David's entourage. He's not going to want to make Saul look like a good king. And all he's going to look for are those parts where Saul screws up. So what you're left with is this incomplete picture of Saul, which is not good. And I'm telling you, it is so obvious because because they go their separate ways. Why don't you read this right here, Rosemary?
Samuel then departed for Ramah, and Saul went up to his home at Gibeah of Saul. Samuel never saw Saul again to the day of his death. But Samuel grieved over Saul because the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel.
Yeah, so they never see each other again in life. That's pretty critical. Pretty critical. Usually we'd say, well, that makes sense. It says it is death. Well, little bit later, Samuel makes a return engagement. The only one that we read of in the whole Bible that happens after he dies. And Saul wants to see Samuel one more time. That's weird. It's in the Bible. We're going to read about it, not next week, but soon. We're going to read about it in about 2 weeks. We're going to read this story of the ghost of Samuel. Now, that's why until the day of his death is such a weird phrase. Because again, it's not really a weird phrase. It's just maybe a throwaway. He never saw him again. You'd say he never saw him again. But never saw him again to the day of his death is very interesting. And it's not good. It's not a good breakup. And Samuel isn't happy. Samuel doesn't walk away going, I'm done with that. It says that he grieved over him. It was sad. It was not a good situation for Samuel, and he was not happy about it, which I think is an indicator that, at least even from David's own group, that this didn't sit well with Samuel. That this was not this is not the way Samuel wanted to play out. So there at least is a recognition, at the very least, there's a recognition that Samuel is not happy about this. He's not happy. And no matter what, though, like you said, there's no forgiveness. There's no, can I have another chance? He doesn't get to see him again. He doesn't get to see him again. And that means that Samuel is not there to tell Saul ever again what God wants him to do. Did Saul have other ways of knowing what God wanted to do? Was he getting messages from other sources? We don't know. But it definitely seems that something was broken. At that point, his direct link back to God is gone. And this is, it's a terrible scene. They go back their own ways. So what happens now? What happens now? What's the next chapter? We are going to read a little bit of it just so you can see what happens, because we don't want to leave off there. That's a terrible place to live. That's a terrible place to break, because well, it's very sad. There's no silver lining out of that. There's nothing you can say here which is, well, but maybe there's hope. This is a terrible place to end. It's a good place to end, by the way, if you want people to come back next week and see the next episode. Gosh, how do they do that? I am so sick of that. I ended up watching 4 or 5 episodes of a very marginal, series because they just ended it so well. They've gotten so good at they're causing binging. It's like what they put in snacks to make you keep eating them. They put something in.
What show is that?
I don't even want to mention it. I was watching. No, I watched. I'm so embarrassed. I watched Reacher on Amazon, and
wasn't bad. You didn't die. Obviously, you lied. But Jay and I
it wasn't bad, but it was so. I said marginal. Marginal meaning that there were parts of it that were fun, but there were also. I was like, this is not worth.
Well, he was a better reacher than Tom Cruise.
Yes, thank you for acknowledging the marginality of that, which is better than Tom Cruise. Anyways, I got stuck. I was watching before I knew it. I watched 4 episodes in one night.
We watched the whole thing.
I came back and anyways, it was all the way they ended it. I had to watch the next episode. So they've gotten so good at making us bingers. We become bingers, but
Great argument against Netflix. You know, I'm glad I don't have Netflix.
it's terrible. It's everywhere though. It's not everywhere. It's in it's on those stations where they're streaming and they give you all the episodes at once. I have,
We only watch MeTV.
there you go. Oh, all right. So I just did what I shouldn't have done, which is I showed you I'm going to show you the next episode. You're not going to go through the whole chapter. What?
That's why the writers did this, so that you'll keep studying.
No, no, they didn't. But where they broke chapters was oftentimes there was a sense that we're moving into a new thing. And that is a good place to end, right? As a logical place. But remember, because this is not read as a Torah portion, we don't know exactly always where the sections end, though this P right here is an indication that even in what we call the Masoretic text, the definitive Hebrew text also has a break right here. So sometimes you'll see when you see these pes, these little pay right here within the brackets there, that is the indicator of an end of a paragraph. Yeah.
I think we've discussed this before, and we don't have to go into it. Just because the Christians decided that
Yeah.
with certain breaks, why did we incorporate it into our Torah?
Because, well, we didn't incorporate it in our Torah. We incorporated it into the way we study it, right? So
Okay.
ever since we've been printing books, we've been printing them like that so that we can have a standardization, because we wanted people look, Christians were the first to really print books, right? The Gutenberg Bible, right? We talk about, they were actually Bibles, the first books that we printed. But because we printed these, because the books were printed, we're like, okay, we'll print them the same way. And, to some extent, look, it was hard to make the argument not to, because they were using it was our Bible. I mean, for the part of the Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible, it's our Bible. So there's really no argument other than, again, our Torah portions break at different places. Like, so when we read a Torah portion, they don't always break at a chapter break. They do oftentimes, but not always, as we see. So in the books of the prophets, it's not as big a deal. Almost always, it's a good break. Almost always, not always. I can think of some examples in the prophets where we'll read it, like even thinking about the prophets that we have, like in Yom Kippur, we read a part, as we were talking about, as Rosemary reminded us of Isaiah, we read a little bit into the next chapter. Sometimes the chapter breaks don't really help us, but it's more of the way we organize it. And again, the chapters, to some extent, I guess you could say, like when it came to Psalms and other books of the Bible that we had to have chapter breaks on or portion breaks, they followed ours. I mean, our Psalms are exactly, the way the Christians took it exactly the way we wrote Psalms. So, look, they're using our Bible anyway, so it's hard to say that, for the sake of working together, that we use their chapters and verses. But here's the next chapter, and you can see why I started here with this.
And the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him as king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and set out. I am sending you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have decided on one of his sons to be king. Samuel replied, how can I go? If Saul hears of it, he will kill me. The Lord answered, take a heifer with you and say, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord.
So here we have the next mission. And he does not have a choice of whether he decides to accept it, though he does decide maybe maybe after a little argument with God, what if Saul hears about it and kills me? This is not maybe a little bit of a mission impossible. I don't want to get killed. And God said, I'll give you cover.
Take a heifer.
Take a heifer with you and say you're doing a sacrifice. Yeah, well, that's what he's doing. He gives them cover. Now, the weird thing about this at first is why is God so cryptic about who he's making king? He says, I'm going to make one of Jesse's sons king. He doesn't tell him which one. He doesn't say, I know the guy I'm going to make king. His name is David, the son of Jesse. He says, I'm going to make one of that guy's sons king. Now, it could be that God hasn't chosen yet. God hasn't made up God's mind yet about who the king is. Or again, maybe he wants Samuel to be a little bit part of the ritual. Samuel is going to be a little bit, feel a little bit invested in this by taking part in the selection of the king. But it is interesting that he's not really told who in particular he's looking for.
There's not a hierarchy.
It's a storytelling technique.
Correct, Rosemary. So this is like every great fairy tale,
Right.
which is,
Once upon a
I mean, they don't tell you what Beowulf's name is until he actually gets to the court of the king. And
there you go. And you did not think you were going to have a Beowulf. You did not think this was English literature class, but Rosemary just taught you a little bit about Beowulf, that it is a great storytelling device. It is a great setup for Cinderella's slipper. I mean, it's got every element of who's, how are we going to find this worthy person of who's going to be king, who's going to be selected.
It's not based on hierarchy or age.
Who has the force? What?
It's not based on age or.
Well, it should be.
Well, the elder-
That's right. That's what you think it's going to be, right? If you go into the story the way, of course, all the stories always flip it. It's always the youngest. But yeah, you go into the story going, yeah, it should be the oldest, obviously. And again, it's who has the force, who's going to be able to levitate the thing, who's going to be able to, be selected. So here's the setup. And God says to him, look, get over it already. That's what he says to him. Get over it.
that's a lousy grief counselor.
Not a lot of patience. Now, however long God gives people to get over this, it's not God. Yes, Samuel's gone overboard with his feeling about Saul. Look, we know that Samuel didn't want to make Saul king in the first place, which is why, to some extent, it's so interesting that now God has to talk him out of his sadness over this. I mean, he didn't want him king. He didn't want to make Saul king.
But Rabbi, we've talked often about what time is in the Bible. This could have allowed plenty of time, right? I mean, we don't know, right? So there could have been a lot of
Too much
waiting
time
time
is
there.
passing by here.
It doesn't seem like it's years and years. Is it months? Is it a year? It does not seem to be 5 years, but it doesn't, you're right. It doesn't say definitively, though there are some clues. There are some clues here.
Like Sharon, well, get over it.
Get over it. That's right. From Moonstruck. No, there is a sense that it couldn't have been too long based on the age of David in relation to Jonathan and some of the other people in this story. It doesn't seem like it's 10 years, but whatever it is, it seems odd that, again, Samuel didn't want to be roped into this king-making stuff in the first place.
It humanizes him.
It does. It also tells us that maybe I got one king-making in me, but I don't want to do this again. And God says, get on your way, get that horn filled up, back up with oil. Your Messiah making oil, which is what it is. It's the Messiah making. You're going to go make some Messiah. And so that's what it means, the anointed one. And he says, but what about that? No. You're going to be able to do this. And so we didn't actually finish the whole setup.
Invite Jesse to the sacrificial feast. And then I will make known to you what you shall do. You shall anoint for me the one I point out to you.
Yeah, you will make the Moshiach. You will Mashachta. You will make me a Messiah. You will anoint me someone. That's what it means. Moshiach. That's what it means. You will anoint me.
Why doesn't translation say Messiah? Because that changes everything.
Of course. But we've gotten so used to in Judaism saying we're going to use the word anoint, and we don't have a verb for it because that is a verb. Mashachta is Messiah me. And if we said that, that would freak people out by saying you Messiah somebody. But that's what it is. You Messiah them. But it is a verb. This is a verb. You shall anoint me, which is why they use the word anoint, which is the word that we normally use for pouring oil or pouring something on somebody. You can anoint someone with stuff besides oil, but usually in the Bible. No, I will point out that in Psalm 23, when it says, you anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Now, you could say that's David saying it to God because David got anointed. But there seems to be an implication by the way we say it or when we say it, that you and I can say it too. That God takes care of me by doing things like anointing my head with oil, making my cup overflow. You don't have to be King David to feel that way. That God will protect us, right? God will love us and do things for us, even when we're in the valley of the shadow of death, even when we're scared. That's not a prayer for the dead person. It's a prayer for you. It's a prayer for the survivors to say, even when I'm sad, even when I'm in my lowest place, that God could do this to me. Again, you could say, well, that's easy for David to say, but we clearly don't say that that's only applying to David. We wouldn't say a psalm at a funeral for David. We say it for ourselves. People forget that because they usually say, oh, you're saying it for the dead person. No, not saying it for the dead person. That's why whenever I say it, I always remind people it's for us. That in our lowest points, we're going to be okay. Because people say when I shall dwell in the house of God forever, but they're talking about the person you just buried in the ground, that they're dwelling in the house of God. No. Dwelling in the house of God means, and it actually doesn't say forever, it says all the days of my life. So the original Hebrew makes a lot more sense than the English translation. Dwelling in the house of God forever seems to imply you're going to be dwelling in the house of God in the world to come or forever and ever. Leorech Yamim means for all the days of my life, which is sometimes the way it's translated. And I shall dwell in the house of God all the days of my life, which doesn't seem to imply in the world to come, but while I'm here in this world. And dwelling in the house of God means I get to be in Jerusalem. I get to be with God, I get to be in a holy place. So there does seem to be that sense that Messiah is not as quite as unique as it is, unless it's being done for a purpose of, again, making someone king. So here's what happens when Samuel comes to town, and this is where we're going to finish up.
Samuel did what the Lord commanded. When he came to Bethlehem, the elders of the city went out in alarm to meet him and said, "Do you come on a peaceful errand?" "Yes," he replied. "I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and join me in the sacrificial feast." He also instructed Jesse and his sons to purify themselves and invited them to the sacrificial feast.
Now, of course, it's interesting because when he comes to town, people aren't necessarily excited to see Samuel. It means that Samuel sometimes came and people were not happy. Like,
We're probably in trouble.
what did we do this time? So yes, it means that Samuel is not always the harbinger of good news. That he oftentimes comes with to lay down the law. So they say, "What's going on?" And he tells them, "Oh, it's good. It's all good." Because it says they went out in alarm, right? So no, it's all good. We're going to have a special feast, and Jesse, bring your sons with you, and you're going to be special. You guys got to get yourselves ready for it. You make yourselves holy.
Yeah, what does that mean? What do they have to do?
Uh,
What's the ritual of making purified?
I don't know if it meant taking a bath. It doesn't really say. It says to basically make yourself. The word purify here really is an interesting one because it's probably better translated as sanctify. The word kadesh is used there, make yourself holy, which again, doesn't make it any clearer.
So it could be the ritual of just prayer then.
Could be, but it could be going to a mikvah. It could be washing off. It could be getting yourself ready. There's definitely something to this, which seems like you're a big part of this celebration.
Would there have been formal clothing? that they
Maybe.
would wear?
Maybe come out in your best Sunday best, right? Come out ready to go. And he says that somehow they're involved in the feast. What's interesting about this is it says it's a sacrificial feast, which means there's a sacrifice. There's a religious element to it. The word here, sacrifice, is 100% used there. Lisboach Adonai, we're making a sacrifice, which again is eventually, we're only allowed to do that in Jerusalem. But right here, you can see people are making sacrifices everywhere. They're making them in Gilgal. They're making them in Shiloh. They're making them out here in Bethlehem, out in the country, because that's where he lived. He lived out in Bethlehem, which is out in the country. As I tell people, it's modern day Kansas, modern day Nebraska or Iowa. It is corn country. It is the wheat country. It is the place where people grow grain, which is why it's called the house of grain, the house of bread, Beit Lechem, the house of bread. So here they are.
When they arrived and he saw Eliab, he thought, surely the Lord's anointed stands before him. But the Lord said to Samuel, pay no attention to his appearance or his stature, for I have rejected him. For not as a man sees does the Lord see. A man sees only what is visible, but the Lord sees into the heart.
Oh, so Samuel's got to learn a little something about the way God works. He teaches them a lesson. Don't look at the big guy. Don't look at Eliab, which, this is David's older brother. It's kind of sad. He doesn't say, I didn't pick that guy. I rejected that one. That's a little harsh, right? It's a little, no, that's not the one. He says, I rejected that one. That means that God, for a second, thought about him. I mean, when you reject something, it means you looked at it and said, I don't want that one. Right? Because if you picked it, you proactively say, no, that's the one. That's different than going, nah, not that one. Let me see another one. Oh, look, no, not that one. So that's essentially what we're looking at here is God teaching Samuel a lesson, but it's a little critical of him. Man, if I'm Eliab, I don't want that in the Bible. It's bad enough I didn't get picked. I got to be rejected. It's one thing not to be picked. It's another to be rejected. He's like, no, not that one. That's not the right one. And again, there's a very important lesson here, of course, which is that God does not see what you and I see. God sees into the person's heart. I see what's inside. And of course, that's a great lesson. And I feel bad for Eliab that gets rejected, but he is not the one.
Does Eliab know he gets rejected?
I don't know, but he's going to know in a second that he wasn't picked. But how does, I don't know if there's a big, I don't know if Samuel looks at him and there's a wah, wah, and then the next one, there's a big loud wah, wah. And then, yep.
Hi,
Next.
Then Jesse called Abinadab and had him pass before Samuel. But he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either.
Well, that's a little bit nicer. It's not rejected. He hasn't chosen this one. So we're getting to meet all of David's brothers. Maybe not the nicest way to meet them, which is, no, this one wasn't any good. But if you're David and you're David's people who are writing the story, you have to have a really good reason why none of the other brothers got taken. There was a bunch of older brothers that David had that weren't worthy of being king. So even if you shy, Jesse is a worthy guy to have a son to be king. It's none of the other guys. It's David. It's the baby. All right, let's go. Keep going.
Next, Jesse presented Shammah, and again he said, the Lord has not chosen this one either. Thus Jesse presented 7 of his sons before Samuel, and Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these.
Yes, and so the Bible spares us a whole listing of 4 more sons that get called out and don't get called. We do get a list of the brothers in the book of Chronicles, so it's not like we don't know their names. They're not lost to history. They probably did pretty well. Once their younger brother became king, they all got a little something. I'm sure it wasn't bad for them. But it's one thing when your younger brother becomes a big success and you get a little taste of the success and you were that close to being picked. Don't think that those brothers might not have had a claim or at least a feeling like, should have been me. Are you kidding me? David, our little scrawny little brother? Are you kidding me? I used to beat that kid up all the time. Stuck his head in the toilet. And now he's king. Now he's the Messiah. I used to anoint him in the toilet. And that's what his brothers would have said. And in all seriousness, that's what people do. That's the human reaction. Our little brother is king. So these guys probably had a real problem with their younger brother. And that might have crept up when David had problems in his own family. Because if you're one of David's sons and you decide, hey, I need to create my own little cadre of inner circle, and you go to your uncle or you go to your cousins and go, hey, why not join my side? And you're going like, what the hell? I don't like David. David never should have been king. I don't like that guy either. I don't like his son, but I want to get David back. You can imagine that this created some bad blood.
So was he really the youngest?
That's what the Bible says. It seems so. It doesn't seem made up, because the issue is why would David make that up about himself?
But that's how
This is
it's
David.
written, you know?
If we assume that David's people wrote this or edited this story, they didn't make it up. So here it is.
Then Samuel asked Jesse, are these all the boys you have? He replied, there is still the youngest. He is tending the flock. And Samuel said to Jesse, send someone to bring him, for we will not sit down to eat until he gets here.
Oh, interesting.
So David didn't even get called to the meeting.
Wasn't even there.
He wasn't even asked to be there. That is David's story. That is the story that David allowed to be told, at the very least.
Because he had a big heart and went out to tend the flock and followed.
He wasn't worthy. His father didn't even figure him worthy to be counted amongst these people. So here's what happened.
So they sent and brought him. He was ruddy-cheeked, bright-eyed, and handsome. And the Lord said, rise and anoint him, for this is the one.
Is the one.
Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord picked David from that day on. Samuel then set out for Ramah.
How old do you think he was?
That's where we're ending.
How old was
Boom.
David?
What?
How old was David?
I don't know.
Like 15?
I don't know. What do you think? He's ruddy. He look at the note here. Ruddy cheeked, bright-eyed, and handsome. He's a kid. He's a kid, and he's not old enough to even be counted amongst the rest of his brothers who again were old enough to make it and to be called out. His father didn't even think he was worthy to be
Realize that
counted.
he's too young to have much of a beard.
Well, he definitely doesn't seem that old. He's still out pasturing the flocks, which means he hasn't reached the age that he can be called in for the meal. And it seems like he's not treated much better than the hired help. And what happens after he does that? There's no big ceremony. Samuel anoints him, and then he gets out of town.
Does he take David with him?
Nope. David is changed. Ruach Adonai, the Spirit of God, grips him, and he becomes a different kind of guy. But Samuel doesn't coach him. Samuel doesn't, according to this, give him any other information. He anoints him. Then the next word is, literally, what does Samuel do? He gets out of town. He gets out of Dodge. And that is literally what he does. Samuel goes back to Ramah. He goes back to his hometown, which is not far away. But that's the last line that we read about after that. And you'll have to come back next week to see what happens to David.
Rabbi,
Yes,
can you stick around for a few minutes after class?
for sure. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Oh, well, you know what? I'll call you. I'll call you on my cell. Okay.
Oh, why don't you do that? That's even better. Thanks.
So I got to show you one more line. I'm sorry. I have to show you one more line because I'm too bingy. The spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord began to terrify him. So I have to tell you, I have to show you that one last line, that the Spirit of God coming on to David meant that the Spirit of God left Saul. And what took its place was not good. It was a bad spirit. He didn't get replaced. He didn't get replaced with nothing. It wasn't like the spirit left and he was like, came and went. I'm normal now. It's an evil spirit, a bad spirit that began to terrify him. It doesn't say it took its place, but it does say he was haunted after that. Somehow the moment that David gets anointed, something shifts inside Saul. It's not just David that feels it. Saul feels it. That energy left him. So as bad as it was for him to know that there was a worthier guy out there, now he felt it. At that moment, he's a different person. So it's not a great way to end, other than the fact that it's good for David, it's bad for Saul. But it is an amazing story. And again, arguably one of the best confrontations, human confrontations in the Bible, because what we're set up with now is the story of David versus Saul. Today, I called it Samuel versus Saul. The next class is David versus Saul. And that's far more compelling because Samuel exists as a prophet. He's got a different job. David is a king. Saul is a king. And that rivalry between those two guys is a rivalry that is so human and so complex. And I would argue is one of the best stories in all of literature, not just the Bible, but in all of literature. I think you're hard pressed to find a more gripping story than the story of David and Saul against each other. A generational struggle between, a guy who's older and the next generation, the next leader. But it's a very, very human struggle. And again, most of us don't have those generational struggles. Most of us don't have those types of fights. But when we read about them and we see them, they make really good stories. We didn't have one in the Super Bowl this last week, but there was one a couple of years ago, the greatest generational, battle between Tom Brady and Patrick Mahomes, or Tom Brady and the next Tom Brady, right? The Joe Burrow versus Tom. We didn't have that this year. We had a Matt Stafford versus a Joe Burrow. It was somewhat generational, but Matt Stafford is not a Tom Brady. He's not a Aaron Rodgers. I think a lot of people wanted to see that kind of generational struggle because there is this great thing to see, the old ways versus the new ways, who's going to win, who do we root for? I guess, depends on your age. It depends on obviously your city and all those kind of things. But we love to see these fights between the new generation and the next generation, right? I joke about it because it happens in sports, but it oftentimes happens in politics. It doesn't seem to be happening in politics anymore. But we did have a generational shift with Obama, and then we went back to, we go back and forth. It's not like one side wins, right? One side doesn't win. Clinton and Bush, we don't have those always. We didn't have one this last year. We had two people in their late 70s that were running against each other, but we oftentimes have those, and we love them because they get to what we are about and where we're going and what we came from. And it'll be interesting to see the next time we have one of those. Who knows? Ironically, who knows what will happen? We could have one where the Republican Party is led by a younger person versus a Joe Biden. you don't know. We don't know at this stage right now what'll happen. So we love those stories, and they're good stories. They're important stories. They're not just stories. They underlie our ethics, our values, our views on the past versus the future, our who we are, because we get caught in between those ourselves.
I'm assuming that this is written by David's chroniclers. This is a story to authenticate the legitimacy of his kingship. Because legitimacy is really important in this story.
Yeah. And we also have to still deal with the fact that Saul was at one time the Messiah. He was anointed king. And once you've been anointed king, you've had the seal of approval. Even if it's been taken away, you still have the seal of approval. What type of power does anointing give you? So we'll see that next week and the week after as we read about Saul. And as I said, Saul was by himself, very little. By the end of the story, we had King David. All right, everybody, we'll see you next week. Stay healthy, or maybe we'll see you tomorrow night for Genesis. Bye-bye.
Everybody.